So like you, I've been waiting on the Mavic 3 to come out for what seems like years. Now, every Mavic that has come out since the Mavic 2 Pro has been smaller than the Mavic 2 Pro. But that's changed today with the Mavic 3. We get a slight bump in the size and a huge bump in image quality. Let me show it to you. All right, so right here, if you get the Fly More kit, it comes with this bag. Incredible bag, probably the most well-engineered bag I've seen in any drone, or really to come with any piece of kit that I've seen. So, Mavic 3, first thing you notice is this huge lens strap gimbal protector that comes on here. Pops off and pretty easy to put back on, so there we go. Now, in my opinion, this Mavic 3 could have been called the Inspire Mini. It looks like it's taking some design cues from the Inspire. And that's not only in design, that is most importantly in the camera right here. This is a dual lens camera. You have a 4/3 sensor paired with a 24mm equivalent variable aperture lens on here. Then you also have a 1/2" sensor with equivalent of 161mm lens. It's pretty interesting because it has very long focal length. All right, here I got a comparison. We got the Mavic 3, Mavic 2 Pro, and in the middle we have the tiny Air 2S. It just looks like the Mavic 3 is a little taller, a little girthier than the Mavic 2 Pro. Obviously the Air 2S is very tiny. All right, next up is this remote right here. This is exactly like the Air 2 and Air 2S remote. No difference at all in anything like this, and that is fine because those work great. The transmission works wonderfully. What else we have though are these new batteries, completely new design from what you'll have been used to in any of the Mavic series. And the thing is these batteries, DJI claims 47-minute flight time. I've gotten pretty close to that. I've definitely been clearing the 40-minute flight time. Pretty cool. Inserts right on the back now. No more pop down from the front. It goes, clicks right into the back. There are no buttons really anywhere on this drone. You just power on the back using the battery and it comes on. Now, just like we had in the Mavic 2 Pro, the Mavic 3 has the Hasselblad color science going on in it. But the biggest story in this new Mavic is the new 4/3 sensor. The sensor is the same size as something you'd find in like a GH5 or what you would see in some of the Inspire series stuff. And it is beautiful. You have a 24mm equivalent lens, which is a little bit wider than what we've seen on the Mavic 2 Pro, and I think that's a bonus. Also has a variable aperture from 2.8 down to, what do they say, f11. I've been testing these apertures to find the sharpest range for you. I'm still doing a few more tests, but that's gonna be in my full review. Just make sure you catch that because from what I've seen, there's a few apertures you wanna stay away from. Now on to what I love most about this camera, and that is the image quality. It doesn't look like a drone. That's the best way I can say it. It has the most beautiful detail that I've ever seen in any portable drone. On top of that is the log profile. I love the log profile in the Mavic 3. It is the flattest profile that I've seen in any of the Mavic series, and it has the most dynamic range, certainly more than what has been the king thus far, which is the Mavic 2 Pro. Not only does it retain 2/3 of a stop more highlight detail, but it looks like maybe there's an extra stop in the shadow details. And that's my favorite part, is that it really digs into the shadows and it opens you up to being able to color grade down into the deeper shadows that you would see with your eyes, but that a lot of cameras will start to crush out. So with properly designed LUTs, you can leave some of that shadow detail in there, giving a much more natural feel to it. I will say with this log profile though, it is the hardest log profile I've had to color grade on any drone, just because of the flatness and also because it has some funny color shifts going on in here. They're not very accurate when left alone on the log profile. The normal profile will give you pretty good color straight out the box, but you lose all the advantages of that dynamic range that you get with a log profile. So we're developing the SkyGrades LUTs for the Mavic 3, and I'll have a link below to those. They're specially designed for this log profile to maintain all that dynamic range in the highlights, but more importantly in the shadows as well. Now, speaking of variable aperture, the thing that pairs with that is the set of NDs. Now, a lot of NDs have a color shift to it. They can shift a little bit green or a little bit magenta. So I wanted to test each of these and see how neutral they were, because they're supposed to be neutral density filters. We went out with them, and I'm happy to say that these ND filters feel very neutral, even up to the 32 stop ND. Now, on the Mavic 3 Cine, you can record in Apple ProRes HQ. It's gonna be right at 1 gig per second of recording on here. So that's a massive file size. I don't know if that's something that a lot of you guys could deal with, but this is just the Mavic 3 standard version. So I'm only able to shoot in the H.265 codec, but I can say the codec is very high quality. I think we're at 150 megabits per second on here. Yeah, 140 megabits per second on the H.265 codec, which is the equivalent of 280 megabits a second on an H.264 codec. That is a beautiful image and reasonable size. So I think for most of us, the Mavic 3 standard version is gonna be perfect. All right, now when testing between the 5.1K and the 4K modes, I noticed that the 5.1K does exactly what you expect. It has a little bit more detail, but the 4K modes seem to be doing a nice oversampling of the 5.1K sensor. It doesn't feel like there's any binning going on. Now, this thing can record 5.1K up to 50 frames per second. In 4K, it can go 60 frames per second and even 120 frames per second. I'm still waiting on the firmware update to be able to test that, but the 60 frames per second at 4K and the 5.1K at 50 frames per second don't show any binning of the image or anything. It looks like they're still getting the full quality readout that you would expect from the 24 frames per second. So there's no trade-off in shooting in these higher frame rates. Now onto the telephoto camera. This is a smaller sensor. This is a 1/2 inch sensor, what you'd expect like in the Mavic 2 Zoom, but with an even longer focal length. The lens on here is 160 millimeter equivalent. Now, shooting with this right now is a little bit frustrating. You have to go into what DJI call Explore mode. When you get in there, you can zoom from 1x, which is using the normal camera, and then you can go to 2x and 4x, which is just digitally cropping the normal camera. And it's not until you get to a 7x zoom that it switches over to the telephoto camera with no digital crop. This is a really interesting focal length because 160 millimeter is very long. You were able to back up and really compress the scene, get some beautiful parallax as you're moving, but there are downsides. And these are big downsides. I'm not happy about them. It's auto exposure only. It does not do this in D-Log, no matter what. It's only 30 frames per second right now. You know, we should be able to do 24. Yeah. But all those things add up to making this second camera on here something that will not be as usable as it could have been had we had 24 frames per second, maybe kept D-Log color just to line up the workflow with the other footage that we're gonna be taking, and had manual exposure on these things, because that would have kept things feeling at least cohesive between both lenses. These are things that can actually be fixed in firmware updates, so maybe that will happen. But as it stands right now, they just feel like two disconnected camera systems a little bit. So I love the idea of this. It's a nice looking image, totally usable in 7X mode. So I think the dual camera system is a great idea, but hopefully the implementation is improved on over time. Okay, now this has omnidirectional sensors all over it in this new APAS 5.0. What that means, as you're flying through multiple objects, things, you know, trees or limbs a little bit overhead, something below you, this thing knows where everything is in the environment. Now, you can feel it when you're flying, you can feel it where it'll apply the brakes, it'll move itself just slightly for you. It's really impressive what they've done with that. All right, so that wraps it up for the first impressions of the Mavic 3. It is a beautiful camera on a portable drone, something that I think all of us have always wanted on a drone. It has a few downsides in the fact that it's a little bit larger than the Mavic 2 Pro, but with that you get better flight time and a much larger sensor. So I think that small trade-off is worth it. The telephoto lens on here on this dual camera system is fair. It gives you something to play with if you really need that longer focal length, and hopefully there'll be some improvements made on it in the future. But overall, this is a super exciting drone. So be sure to subscribe and come back, because I'm gonna have my full review and setup guide for the Mavic 3 coming out very soon. There's some tricks in here that you're gonna wanna know before you start flying. But until then, get your Mavic 3 and I'll talk to you soon.